Well, I just harvested the last of our pumpkins. We've got a nice little crop here coming just from one vine. You might remember this is Autumn Gold variety that we planted back last summer, and it's given us a nice yield of 4 small pumpkins that will do well for a jack-o'-lantern for decorating. Now there are a few pumpkins remaining on the vine, but because we've had a frost here in Stillwater, they will not develop any further. In fact, the vine has died back almost completely due to forces of both powdery mildew disease and frost, and so it's time to clean it up. Now in the fall, when you're cleaning out the garden, remember that garden sanitation is the key to eliminating a lot of insect and disease problems for next year. And if you remember, with vine crops in general, we always have a lot of both kinds of problems, whether it's squash beetle, squash bug, or cucumber beetle, or powdery mildew disease. It's a good idea to get these vines completely out of the garden. In fact, you don't want to compost them unless you're sure that that pile is going to break down to 160 degrees and heat up enough to kill out any of those diseases. Otherwise, it's a good idea to just burn the plants or throw them away, get them completely out of the garden so that you don't harbor any diseases for next year. This is particularly important with squash bug because the squash bug overwinters in trash in the garden in general. And so with garden sanitation, with the squash bug, it's a good idea to rototill the area where you've been growing vine crops. And if there's a fence row nearby that has very tall weeds, clean that out this fall also so that the bug will not have a place to overwinter. We've even found live squash bugs along the foundation of buildings in the middle of February, so they're very, very tough. It's a good idea not to give them a place to overwinter. So I'm going to get this pumpkin vine completely out of the garden, and then later on I'll show you how you can salvage your tomato plants that have been nipped back by frost so you can still harvest a few and keep a few for use this fall. After you finish cleaning up your vine crops, take a look at those tomatoes also, because chances are, like ours, they've been nipped back by the frost. That's what this black foliage is the result of. Now in tomatoes, because we've just had a frost so far and not a hard freeze, the fruit down in the canopy is still just fine and perfectly healthy. And this can be stored and kept indoors and it will ripen up later on. Now there are some fruits that were exposed to frost that were up on the top, such as these right here, and they're not any good. And this is a typical sign of frost damage. It'll look very water-soaked. The skin will have almost a translucent appearance to it. You know, tomatoes like that, it's best just to either compost them or dispose of them in some way, get them out of the garden completely. Now tomatoes such as this one, it already has started to change just a little bit from green to light yellow to almost a pinkish cast. With a tomato like this, you can wrap it individually in newspapers and store the tomatoes in a box indoors. Check them frequently for any sign of rotting, and they will ripen up within a few weeks so that you can have some tomatoes later on in the home for fresh use. If you don't have room to store all of the good green tomatoes that you still have on the vine, then you might want to make some green tomato pie or relish or something like that. Find a use for them, or tell your friends. There are a lot of people who love to have fresh green tomatoes to use. Now on tomato vines, this is another crop that has a lot of disease problems. And it's a good reason to get it out of the garden entirely and not let the vines sit there all winter until next spring. Our plant pathologist, Steve George, tells us that Septoria leaf spot, which is a serious problem here in Oklahoma, overwinters on tomato vines. If you remember, this is a disease that we saw on the foliage early last summer that requires a very regular fungicide spray. So a good way to prevent Septoria leaf spot from attacking your vines next year, or at least lessen its effects, are to get the tomato vines out of the garden entirely. But for now, make sure you harvest some of those green tomatoes and put them to use in the garden. Now, we've talked the past few minutes about garden sanitation and the importance of getting plant materials out of the garden and clean cultivating for winter, but also in the past recent shows, we've talked about growing a cover crop. This may sound a little bit confusing. You may be thinking, well, aren't those insects that we've talked about that overwinter, such as squash bugs, aren't they going to go right from where the vine crops were and migrate over to the cover crops and stay there through the winter? They may find that as a site for hibernation. However, with a cover crop, we'll be tilling that under later this winter and disturbing that site. So any insects that may overwinter in that cover crop will not find protection through the winter, and they will be destroyed when we do our late winter cultivation of the cover crop. So that's okay for the garden. But so far as plants that have died back, particularly the ones that have disease and insect problems, get those out of the garden now, and you'll be one step ahead next summer.